Portraits. Have you had your picture taken at school, or is there a picture of you on a wall or shelf at home? Then that's your portrait. That's what we call a picture of a person. Portraits can be taken with a camera, or they can be drawn or painted. Perhaps the most famous portrait in the world is the Mona Lisa. It was painted by the Italian artist Leonardo da Vinci about 500 years ago. Look at the expression on Mona Lisa's face. For hundreds of years, people have been fascinated by her expression. Is she happy? Is she looking at you or at something else? What do you think she might be thinking? Some portraits can tell a lot about a person and the times in which he lived. Look at the portrait called Edward VI as a child by Hans Holbein the Younger. Edward's father was a king, King Henry VIII of England, who lived more than 400 years ago. The writing at the bottom of the painting, in an old language called Latin, tells Edward to grow up to be like his father. In this portrait, Edward is a little over 1 year old. Is this how most 1-year-old children look like? What's the first thing you notice about this child? Some people notice his fine red and gold clothing or his fancy hat with an ostrich feather. Do you see the rattle he holds in his left hand? It's made of gold. Where does young Edward seem to be looking? Notice how still and straight he sits. Now imagine, how long would it take to paint a portrait like this? Do you think the real baby Edward sat still in this pose for as long as it took the painter to finish the painting? Now let's look at a portrait of another little boy. Unlike the portrait of Edward VI, this portrait shows the boy's whole body. You might think at first that he's a girl, because of his long hair, red lips and fancy costume. Little boys in wealthy families sometimes dressed like this a couple of 100 years ago. This little boy's name is Manuel, and his portrait was painted by the Spanish artist Francisco Goya. How does Goya draw your attention to the boy? Look at the colour of his clothes. They're bright red with a shiny sash around his waist. Look at the light that seems to be shining around his head. But there's more to this portrait than the boy. Don Manuel is holding a string. Where does it go? Can you follow it down and see it's tied to the leg of the boy's pet bird? But wait a minute. What's that sitting in the darkness behind the bird? Cats. How many cats can you find? Can you see 2 pretty clearly? And if you look very carefully, you can see the eyes of the third cat glowing dimly just a little above the other cats' heads. What are the cats looking at? Cats like to pounce on birds, but does Don Manuel seem to know this? Self-portraits. Take a good look at yourself. Sometimes an artist paints a portrait of himself. This is called a self-portrait. A self-portrait doesn't have to look like a photograph. You can paint yourself in many different ways, and each way will say something different about the way you feel about yourself and the way you want other people to see you. The Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh painted many self-portraits. This one shows him when he was 36 years old. How does Van Gogh look at you? Does he seem calm or worried? Are you surprised by the colour he used to paint the shadows under his eyes? The patches of green contrast with the red of his hair and beard. Look back for a minute at the Mona Lisa. Do you see what is behind her? There's a landscape with mountains and a river. Now look at what Van Gogh painted in the background of his picture. Swirling lines of blue and green. Where else can you find curving blue lines in Van Gogh's painting? You get a very different feeling from a self-portrait painted by an American artist, Norman Rockwell. In this painting, called Triple Self-Portrait, Rockwell has fun with the idea of painting a picture of himself. How many times does Norman Rockwell show himself here? He paints a picture of himself looking in the mirror to paint a picture of himself. Do you see how, in the mirror, his eyes are hidden by his glasses, but shown clearly in the painting he is working on? In this picture, Rockwell has copies of other famous portraits tacked to the upper right of his canvas. Can you find a self-portrait of Van Gogh among Rockwell's collection?